Good morning. It's Wednesday, November 27th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 418 days old. I'm your host, Jonathan Schanzer. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. A ceasefire is now in effect as of 4 o'clock this morning. An American brokered agreement took hold in Lebanon. Some say it was the result of clever diplomatic maneuvers. Some will say this was the result of international pressure. I don't buy it. This thing ended because Israel opened up a can of kick-tukas on Hezbollah. The group is in bad shape after a series of crippling blows that Israel has delivered since September. I don't believe for a minute that Hezbollah is going to abide by all the terms, but I also know that Israel won't allow the group to rearm to the same levels that it achieved before the war. In fact, there was a skirmish this morning. With any luck, we'll see calm in Lebanon begin to spread to the 6 other fronts where Israel has been fighting. It won't end the state of war between Iran and Israel, but it might allow Israel to catch its breath, and Iran will need to decide whether it wants to keep testing its luck after taking it on the chin more than a few times itself during this war. We'll analyze all of that and more right here today on the FDD Morning Brief. Today's guest is Bruce Hoffman. He's a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's a tenured professor at Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. He's professor emeritus of terrorism studies at St. Andrews University, Scotland, a nice place to visit, by the way. He previously held the corporate chair in counterterrorism and counterinsurgency at the RAND Corporation. He spent some time in an academic capacity at the CIA. He spent time in Baghdad. He's published a ton on the study of terrorism. In short, he's an incredibly impressive person. We're going to talk to him in just a few minutes right here on the FDD Morning Brief. The war in the north. Let me try that again. The war in the north may now be over. If the ceasefire holds, Israel managed to dodge a bullet. Actually, it managed to dodge a few 100,000 rockets. Hezbollah's mistake was that it hesitated. It could have invaded Israel on October 7th when Hamas did the same. It didn't. A low-intensity conflict ensued. The group fired nearly 10,000 rockets before the Israelis decided that enough was enough. What followed was a series of breathtaking operations and strikes that crippled Hezbollah. The future of the terror group is now unclear. The Iranian regime is now planning to rebuild its most powerful terror proxy. But with Israel's October 8th mindset, there is no way Hezbollah ever returns to half of its previous power. At least that's what the Israelis are saying. A fragile calm is what we have now, and there's no guarantee of continued quiet. More importantly, huge questions linger about the future of Lebanon. That country also dodged a bullet. Israel didn't flatten the place, even though it could have, but it's still an economic and political disaster. It's a failed state. Frantic diplomatic maneuvers and the withholding of weapons to Israel by the Biden White House may have saved Lebanon from total destruction, but now comes the hard part. If Lebanon doesn't find a way forward, one without the heavy influence of Iranian proxy groups, war will just flare up again. Can someone make Lebanon great again? We'll soon find out. But if we're not careful, this country is well on its way to looking like Somalia. Now for your headlines. Headline 1, the Israeli government is moving ahead with the construction of a security barrier along the Jordanian border. The plan is to build a high-tech fence along the entire border, which is some 192 miles long. Yesterday, Israel's defense ministry announced that preparatory work, including drawing up engineering plans, assessing potential environmental hazards, and constructing a portion of the barrier, is underway. This preliminary phase is expected to cost tens of millions of shekels and take months to complete. But the truly complicated part is not written anywhere in the plan. How do you map the route of a fence that will anger the Israeli left or the Israeli right or the Palestinians or the Jordanians for geopolitical reasons? The fence is bound to anger one or two or more of these groups at minimum. It's a boundary, a political one, and no one likes it when you make new ones in that part of the world. But you know what? Tough. Iran is taking advantage of Israel's porous border with Jordan to flood the West Bank with weapons. There was actually a big report today about a massive weapons seizure. So there's not much choice here for Israel. Here's hoping this thing can be built without stoking another round of violence. Headline 2, Germany announced charges against 4 suspected Hamas operatives. 2 are Lebanese nationals. One is Egyptian, another one is Dutch. All four allegedly held high-ranking positions within Hamas and had direct ties to the terror group's senior military chiefs, at least the ones that are still living. Authorities in Germany and the Netherlands arrested the men almost a year ago. We're just hearing about it now. According to German prosecutors, these operatives hoarded weapons that were intended to be used in attacks on European soil. The cell allegedly considered targeting the Israeli embassy in Berlin, a U.S. airbase in southwestern Germany, and Berlin's Tempelhof airport. Between June and December 2023, the men made several trips to Poland in search of more weapons. Not surprising to see the Germans thwart this plot. The Dutch, on the other hand, didn't have that on my bingo card. Headline 3, the United Arab Emirates announced the arrest of 3 suspects in connection to the murder of Rabbi Tzvi Kogan, the Chabad emissary, whose body was recovered over the weekend. As expected, the 3 men are Uzbek nationals. Abu Dhabi published photos of them handcuffed and blindfolded. Emirati authorities said that they're still working on identifying a motive. Right. Now, here's where things get interesting. The Uzbeks fled to Turkey after murdering Kogan. Turkish intelligence reportedly identified the flight that the suspects boarded, and police nabbed the guys in Istanbul. Ankara, a terribly anti-Semitic government that supports Hamas and a lot of other terror groups, then willingly and immediately extradited the suspects to the UAE. The whole thing was wrapped up quickly and neatly. Too quickly and too neatly, if you ask me. The whole thing just strikes me as off. It might even stink. Maybe we'll learn more, maybe we won't, but I think there are a lot of questions that still need to be answered. And bonus headline 4, Russia is apparently teaming up with the Houthis to recruit Yemeni fighters for the war in Ukraine. Just when you thought it couldn't get any weirder, Moscow is reportedly working with a Houthi-backed company to draft Yemeni nationals into the Russian military. The draftees travel to Russia, where they are offered nice salaries and Russian citizenship. If they survive, maybe they can benefit from it. But from what we're hearing, many of the North Koreans sent to fight in Ukraine are coming back in body bags. As for this arrangement with Russia, the Houthis get stuff in return too, specifically weapons. U.S. Special Envoy for Yemen, Tim Lenderking, told the Financial Times that the arms Moscow is dangling before the Houthis would enable the Iran-backed rebels to better target ships in the Red Sea. All right, now it's my pleasure to welcome Bruce Hoffman to the show. He's Senior Fellow at CFR, Council on Foreign Relations. He's a legend in the field of terrorism studies. He's at Georgetown University now, but he's been all over Washington. He's worked in Baghdad during the war there in Iraq. He did a stint at the Rand Corporation, but it really doesn't matter where he works. He just keeps cranking out smart stuff that helps us all better understand the threat of terrorism worldwide. Let's talk to Bruce live right now on the FDD Morning Brief. Welcome to the FDD Morning Brief, Bruce Hoffman.
Thanks very much for having me, Jonathan.
All right, let's start with something I think somewhat basic. There was a moment in DC maybe 10 years ago, everyone was focused on combating terrorism, and then somehow we pivoted away from that. Are we still fighting a war on terrorism? As an expert on terrorism studies, is it the same battle? Is it just the politics and the rhetoric that shifted? Just give us a sense of how you view things right now.
Firstly, every president since the war on terror began over 2 decades ago has declared victory over our terrorist enemies. And I think without exception, all those declarations have been either overly optimistic or precipitous. And if anything, we're not only still fighting a war on terror, but I would say that it's intensifying, becoming more complicated, and especially at a time when our resources are depleted by having literally to cover a waterfront of other threats, from great power rivals, from lesser great power rivals and axes of evil, and just a multiplicity of terrorist groups. One statistic just to underscore my argument. There are 5 times as many Salafi jihadi terrorist groups, that is to say, terrorist entities that ascribe to the ideology and even the strategy of either Al-Qaeda or ISIS, today designated by the State Department as foreign terrorist organizations, than there were on September 10th, 2001. 5 times as many. We're still fighting this war. And then, as you know, there's a multiplicity of other adversaries the United States faces that use these tactics against our interests and Western interests and our allies' interests.
Yeah, and I've got to imagine it's going to get worse in the aftermath of the current war in the Middle East. The battles that we lost in that war on terror seem to be haunting us. At least that's what I would argue, our inability to defeat the Taliban in Afghanistan in particular, and then our disastrous withdrawal has apparently emboldened Russia to invade Ukraine. We've heard Vladimir Putin talk about that. I think it probably also has influenced the Iranian regime to perhaps think that we didn't have the ability or will or capabilities to fight back against some of their malign activities by some of their proxies. Would you make that same assessment? Do you think that the loss to the Taliban, and maybe even the loss that we surrendered in Iraq as well, do you think that is influencing what we're watching right now on the world stage?
Absolutely, there's no doubt. In fact, you can see this empirically because two of the first groups that rallied to applaud the Taliban's victory when they reconquered Afghanistan and ignominiously forced the United States to withdraw, as you described, that praised the Taliban's victory, that heralded that religious fervor coupled with persistence and perseverance would always triumph, especially over Western enemies, were Hezbollah and Hamas. So clearly they got the message too. And don't forget, Israel and the Israel Defense Forces are probably the military in the world that is the most compatible with the United States, that's operationally very similar, same weapon systems that we often develop in tandem, same training, doctrine, reliance on security. Well, the Taliban's narrative is that they and their allies in Al-Qaeda defeated the most technologically advanced military in the history of mankind. That was the United States. More than that, they double down and say they defeated the armies of, or the militaries of, two of the world's reigning superpowers of the 20th century. They forced the Soviet Union's Red Army to withdraw in December 1989, then the United States military to leave in August 2021. In terms of burnishing or polishing or furthering a narrative, I mean, right there, we understand why terrorists fight on. They believe that they fundamentally can outlast their adversaries. And that's exactly what Osama bin Laden said in one of his last publicly released videotapes in October 2004, right before the election. He said, "We know we can't defeat you militarily on the battlefield. We're going to enmesh you in prolonged wars of attrition where your ultimate defeat is preordained." And in fact, 2004, no one took him seriously. In 2021, his prediction looked actually quite prescient.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's interesting also because I think the Iranian strategy against Israel that we've watched over the last 14 months has been one of a war of attrition. And that runs 180 degrees counter to what the Israeli military doctrine is, lightning wars on other people's turf. I think we've seen that perhaps the Shiite axis, as it were, may have learned from what the Sunnis did against the United States. Of course, the difference is that Israel was defending its own territory. But let me pivot to that. I mean, I want to talk to you specifically about the war that has been unfolding in the Middle East. We may be watching at least some element of an endgame, but are you surprised by the capabilities and arsenals of these non-state actors that have attacked Israel, the Houthis, the militias in Iraq and Syria, what we call the PMUs, or even Hamas and Hezbollah? They look like they are different terror organizations than they were when I first started studying terrorism some 20 years ago.
No, you're absolutely correct about that. I'm not surprised, but I'm completely dismayed and alarmed. I mean, look at the Houthis. 4 or 5 years ago, who would have paid any serious attention to their capabilities beyond causing violence in Yemen, at the southern end of the Arabian Peninsula? Now we've seen their ability to interdict international commerce, to attack sea cargo transiting through the Red Sea. They've become international players. Why is that? It's because state sponsorship, which about 20 years ago we thought we had eliminated, in our hubris, in our overconfidence, I think initially in the war on terror, invasion of Iraq knocked out one chief state sponsor, Saddam Hussein. That panicked Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, who then gave up his chemical and biological arsenal and agreed to cooperate in the war on terrorism. We chalked those up, and they were great victories. But the trouble is, I think the international cooperation against these rogue states, especially on their finances, has gradually eroded over time, as you described at the beginning, as we precipitously declared victory about a decade ago and moved on to great power competition. And unfortunately, with the loosening of our sanctions on state sponsors, they have gotten the power, the financial resources to surreptitiously and now much more overtly arm their proxies, and we see the repercussions when a two-bit terrorist group of 4 or 5 years ago now has a huge impact on the global economy.
Yeah, and I've got to say, and you don't need to say it, I'll say it. I think the JCPOA from 2015, the JPOA, the interim nuclear deal from 2013, I think that also yielded the Iranian regime a massive amount of cash that they were able to funnel off to groups like the Houthis. That's one of the few groups that we know for sure benefited from the JCPOA, from that sanctions relief. And I think that we're going to have to reconsider all of that. I know it's going to be a partisan, bitter battle over the logic or the wisdom of dealing with regimes like Iran, but I do think we've probably, at least I hope, we've learned a lesson. So, yeah, I mean, let's get to those state actors for a second that have helped finance and train those that are waging this war. We all know that Iran is bad news, but what about some of those other actors? I mean, I'm thinking about countries like Qatar and Turkey. They've been countries that I've watched for years, very frustrated at the lack of policy as it relates to their sponsorship of terror groups. I mean, we know that Qatar has been a home and a host to Hamas over the years. The Turks are now set to inherit that as the Qataris have been forced, at least it seems, to jettison the group from Doha. There may be a few others. Do we have the right policies in place to halt malign activities as it relates to state sponsors?
Absolutely not, because as you've just described, we have problems from rogue states that are active state sponsors that are providing arms, finances, training. But we also face challenges now arising from state enablers of terrorism that turn a blind eye to their nefarious activities, that allow charities to still fund these groups, that fund terrorist groups thinking that they're moderating them when they're not. And this is a huge problem. I mean, it's a sea change from 20 years ago when there really was an international commitment to stop state sponsorship, whether it was active or tacit. And what we've seen is we've grown overconfident that we defeated our terrorist enemies, that we've moved on from the war on terror, when in reality we haven't, is that our inaction or our lack of attention on this dimension of the issue has breathed new life and confidence into both state sponsors and state enablers, to where we have this terrible situation in the Middle East now that has become so complicated and so fraught because it's so interconnected. But it's not just the military defeat or the kinetic defeat of terrorist organizations that we have to focus on, but it's also undermining their lifelines, the oxygen that they survive on, which tends to be firstly sanctuary and safe haven, and secondly a conduit of finances.
It seems to me like just, listening to you here, we've got the designation of state sponsor of terror, SSTs as we call it. What if we had state enablers of terrorism? Maybe we need to create a new bureaucratic designation of sorts that it's a second tier that begins to target some of those other countries. Maybe that's something we can think about in the next administration or administrations to come. Certainly doesn't seem like a bad idea off the top of my head. We had Daphne Richmond Barak on our program. You and I spoke about her just a few minutes ago before we went on air. She's an expert in tunnel warfare, as you know, and she walked us through how tunnels have played a major role in this war. Obviously, this is a somewhat new innovation for terrorist groups. Are there other tactics that you've been watching that might signal a change in the way that terrorists fight moving forward?
This, I think, is one of the biggest challenges we face amongst the many we've already discussed, is that we may have thought we won the war on terror and could focus on other issues. But meanwhile, terrorists throughout the world are harnessing new technologies, often commercially available off-the-shelf ones, and continuing to prosecute their campaigns using new tactics and new weapons. I would say the tunnels obviously have been an enormously complicating factor in Israel's campaigns in Gaza and also in the north, in southern Lebanon as well. I would say part and parcel or hand in glove with that is the threat from whatever you call them, unmanned aerial systems, unmanned vehicles, drones, in other words. It's very rare throughout history that weapons that have been used on the battlefield, let's say the rocket-propelled grenade, have not found their way into terrorist hands and enhanced terrorist capabilities. And I would argue, I mean, just based alone from what one read in the Wall Street Journal a few months ago about how Unidentified drones or UAS, unmanned aerial systems, hovered over Langley Air Force Base in Virginia for 17 days, basically where the F-22 Raptors are stationed that protect Washington, D.C. from any kind of attack. I would argue we don't have protocols, we don't have tactics, we don't have procedures in place to counter the threat from these vehicles. And when terrorists export them from the battlefields of Gaza, Israel, Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, and the Red Sea to urban centers in the West and in the United States, we're going to face, I think, a new terrorist threat that we really have yet to come to grips with.
I think that's right. And I think the irony of it should just be clear to all of us. I mean, it was the Israelis that pioneered the use of drones, some decades ago. And then obviously the US adopted them, the West adopted them. And now look where we are. You can see that there is nothing that can be innovated by Western or allied countries that can't be hijacked by terrorist groups. And especially, as you know, they come right off the shelf. Last question for you before I let you go. I know you wrote a book recently about right-wing extremism here in the United States. But I guess my question to you right now is, are you concerned about the return of radical left-wing terrorism as it relates to these kind of pro-Hamas forces that we've seen on campus and on Main Street across the United States? Some have warned that this could become a bigger problem in the weeks or even months ahead. Just curious your thoughts there.
Absolutely, I'm concerned. We started writing this book on far-right terrorism in America in 2020 at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, when there were lots of racist, anti-Semitic, xenophobic traction gained by extremist groups exploiting the pandemic. But that was the threat then. The threat now still remains for many of these violent far-right extremists. But certainly after what we've seen the past year, it is surfaced now, or resurfaced, one should say, from violently inclined far left extremists. We see just in recent weeks, the listing of Samidun, a supposed Palestinian prisoners organization, has been listed by both the US Department of the Treasury and Canada's Ministry of Finance as a terrorist entity that is receiving funds from terrorist organizations. We see how historical, traditional terrorist groups like the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, has continued to engage in terrorism, even in the October 7th attacks, and it's believed or reported that they even hold some of the Israeli hostages. But they've engaged in a very active campaign of subversion in the West and in the United States, funneling money and encouraging protests and demonstrations. So, yeah, I mean, this goes back to the first question you asked in our earlier discussion, is that we face a waterfront of threats. Firstly, from great power and lesser power adversaries, as we know, but also from an almost dizzying array of terrorist adversaries on the far right and the far left that are Shia as well as Sunni, and that also have been emboldened in recent years and almost described to my mind, something that's forgotten, but was one of the most revealing indications of the terrorist mindset or strategy was on Hassan Nasrallah in May 2000, articulated the spiderweb theory, that in other words, using a verse from the Quran, that Israel and then in turn the West, are like a spider's web. They look strong from a distance, but you get close up, they've become materialistic, they've become politically dysfunctional, they've become divided and polarized, and therefore you can just sweep them away with your hand. And that, I think, is the dominant belief, is that the United States, the West, Israel have become these weak societies that can be overthrown. And this is only, I think, fueled from whatever dimension, this array of threats. It's built confidence and a hubris in our adversaries that they can somehow, through a long war of attrition, divide and conquer us in essence, or not conquer us literally, but divide us and therefore weaken us, so that we become less of a force in international politics.
Well, we're going to have to prove them wrong on that somehow. I think, we'll see where that all goes. Bruce, I want to thank you for joining us this morning on the FDD Morning Brief.
You're very welcome.
All right, here's what FDD has on tap for you today. John Hardy of FDD's Russia program is tracking Moscow's latest missile attacks on Ukraine and the nuclear saber rattling by Putin. John argues that Moscow aims to use this escalation to instill fear in Kiev's Western supporters, including here in Washington. In this context, he argues that it is crucial for President Biden in his final days in office and President-elect Trump to focus on countering Russia by providing more of the weapons Ukraine needs most to win the war. FDD's Mark Dubowitz and Jacob Nagel have co-authored a piece in the Jerusalem Post making the case for why Israel must shift its strategy toward the ultimate goal of dismantling the Islamic Republic. They make the case yet again why Israel and the U.S. should be pushing all instruments of power to support the Iranian opposition. Man, that is overdue. Finally, my colleague David Adesnik has penned a piece in Canada's National Post on the ICC's unfounded and ludicrous accusations against Israel and its leaders. Canada, which played a key role in the founding of the ICC, has agreed to abide by the court's rulings following its arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. However, David argues that Ottawa should reject this stance given the ICC has overstepped its mandate by making blatantly false charges against a country over which it has no jurisdiction. Weaponized lawfare at its finest here, folks. Do better, Trudeau. Come on, seriously. And that is the ball game, folks. Read our expert analysis on our website, FDD.org. Read our quick takes on X at FDD. Check out our Instagram and YouTube channels, as always. And please do support our work with a tax-deductible donation at FDD.org/invest. We're off on Friday. We're giving the Morning Brief team a well-deserved breather for Turkey Day. But don't you worry. We're back again on Monday for another go. And our guest is going to be a really amazing one. I've been trying to get him on the show for months. I'm talking about Captain Chris Hill, call sign Chowda, one of the best call signs I've heard in a long time, who spent months out at sea battling the Houthis. We're going to talk to him about what it was like battling the Iran-backed group in Yemen from the sea. Should be fascinating. Until then, happy Thanksgiving. I'm Jonathan Schanzer signing off for FDD.